On January 19th, 2021, 2 weeks after a violent insurrection and 1 day before Joe Biden was sworn into office, the singer-songwriter Peter Mulvey published a new tune. The song opens with the narrator observing a baby in the back seat of an adjacent car at the fuel pump. It reaches its climax in the second verse. It goes like this. Little one, may I remind you that you and I live in the 80th straight decade of a steady decline in violence, which used to be the curse of our species, and so things probably should, and yet they don't feel just fine. 'Cause on the eve of the inaugural, there's a look of pure nervousness on every face that I see. I mean, I know things rise and they fall, but like everyone else, I never thought that that applied to you and me. So here we are, once again, on the eve of the inaugural. Of course, part of the story of how Donald Trump was elected a second time is that a number of decidedly good trends in this country were simply not enough to convince very many people who felt unseen, undervalued, or just angry and scared about a country in flux. And my guess is that many of us are asking ourselves serious questions right now about the next 4 years and what they may hold. And so things probably should, and yet they don't feel just fine. It might feel like we'll be contending with some version of the Unatana Tokef prayer. Who shall live, who shall die, who by water, who by fire, who shall have rest, and who shall wander, who shall be at peace, and who pursued, who shall be serene, and who tormented, who shall become impoverished, and who enriched, who shall be debased, and who exalted. These questions may also haunt us this week, even as we receive such welcome news about our hostages. Even so, things probably should, and yet they don't, feel just fine. We might be wondering, in a time when factions and self-interest reign supreme, what does liberation look like? Unatana Tokef reminds us each Rosh Hashanah that the world can feel like a zero-sum place. But our tradition, I think, ultimately insists otherwise. We exist in concentric circles of identity, of collectivity, the self, the immediate family, the extended family. These connections animate and obligate us in powerful ways. That's why we've been singing Achenu for our hostages for 470 days. That's why we care about people we've come to know but have never met. Romi Gonen, Nama Levi, Ofer Calderon, Hisham Al-Sayed, Baby Kfir Bibas. They put simply our mishpacha, and it appears, God willing, at long last, they'll be coming home. But to return again to Peter Mulvey's song, on the eve of their release, there's a look of pure nervousness on every face that I see, because this deal, its unfolding, its aftermath comes with so very many questions, troubling, even horrifying questions. Mi chai, mi met. Who among the 98 is alive? Who is dead? Who was violated in captivity? Who could be pregnant or a new mother? What will healing look like for those who live after 470 days in hell? And other questions, will the ceasefire hold? Will the war finally come to an end? What will the lives of 2 million Gazans be like? Who will rebuild? Who will ensure that rebuilt hospitals and schools heal and educate, but don't teach hate and don't become rocket launching pads for the next attack? And what about many of the Palestinians to be released in this exchange, especially the ones with blood on their hands, who might emerge as the next Yahya Sinwar, who you'll recall was released in the last hostage prisoner exchange. There are troubling questions, too, about violent Jewish terrorists, a number of whom were just released from administrative detention to placate Bezalel Smotrich, and against the warning of the Shin Bet that they're likely to carry out further terrorist attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank. I guess all of this is to say that though the prospect of our hostages coming home should fill us with immense relief, unadulterated joy, I, for one, am finding it hard to fully access those positive feelings when there's so much uncertainty before us. And still, I'm grateful. I'm so grateful for the release of our people. And this Shabbat feels like the right one to celebrate liberation because it's this week that we begin the book of Exodus. And in chapter 3, Moshe has fled from Egypt, having killed the taskmaster, and he's tending to his father-in-law's flock in Midian when he encounters God at the Snesh and Nenu'ukal, at that bush that burns and is not consumed. And the Holy One calls out to him, Moshe, Moshe, and he replies, Hineni, here I am. And then comes the call to liberation, and God said, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I'm mindful of their suffering. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians. Va'aloto min ha'aretz hahi el eretz tova urachava el eretz zavat chalav udvash, and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. From that time until this time, the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim, redeeming our captives, has been sacrosanct to Jewish communities, in some ways all the more so since the advent of the modern state of Israel, which has seen the absorption of millions of displaced Jews after centuries and centuries of exile. For generations now, we've watched as Jewish refugees have streamed in from Poland and Bavaria, from Iraq and Yemen, from Russia and Persia and Egypt, Ethiopia, the mountains of Azerbaijan. So many of these communities came fleeing oppression to our ancestral homeland. With the words of Exodus 19:4 on their tongues, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you al kanfei nesharim, on eagle's wings, and brought you to me. Each wave of immigrants came yearning for that biblical promise. This Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, this land flowing with milk and honey. And so tomorrow, God willing, the Red Cross, let's not forget, for the very first time in 470 days, will meet and then escort the first group of hostages out of the Gaza Strip and into Eretz Israel. And here's something interesting. Do you know what the code name that the IDF has assigned to this operation is? So it's Operation Derech Eretz. Derech Eretz is a multi-layered term. It means the way of the land, or perhaps in this case, the road to the land. Paradoxically, the street that Miriam and I lived near and ate falafel on during our first year of marriage is called Derech Aza, the road to Gaza. But Derech Eretz can also mean, in addition to a road to the land, it can mean common decency. For example, in that same chapter 19 of Exodus, after God tells Moshe about the eagle's wings, that we should be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, Moshe conveys the divine message to the elders. They in turn respond, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh. All that God has instructed, we will do. But then the text says something curious. Moshe relays that message back to God. Why? God didn't hear it from the source? And the Midrash in the Mechelted, the Rabbi Ishmael, says the Torah teaches us Derech Eretz. Moses didn't need to relay the message to God, but it was the decent, it was the proper, the right thing to do. To celebrate our liberation is righteous, to be sure, but as I reminded us a couple of weeks ago, our tradition resists triumphalism, resists glorifying violence. This too is derech eretz. The violence of these past 15 months that preceded this salvific moment in Gaza, the violence that hobbled Hezbollah, chastened Iran, helped to dethrone Assad, the tyrant. Sometimes that violence was necessary. Other times it was not. Pride in victory says the value of derech eretz should not be the celebration of suffering. That's why we truncate our Hallel on Pesach, why we diminish our cups of wine at the Seder when we're reciting the plagues. A Jewish worldview insists that the concentric circles of identity must not stop at family, at nations, and their borders. Ripples of godliness extend across this planet to our entire species, and this planet which has been entrusted to us by God. Peter Mulvey's song on the eve of the Inaugural ends with a coda, which goes like this. Little one, I bequeath you this hurtling rock with its rainforest lungs and its molten iron heart, its tattered oceans and weary flora and fauna among whom we hominids have made a tentative start. It's this kind of liberation, a belief in collective liberation that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. taught as well. And on the eve of the national holiday bearing his name, whether or not we fully share his commitment to nonviolence, we should admire and celebrate it. On the eve of this inaugural, 8 days to the day after Donald Trump gave his infamous American Carnage speech, we, my friends, should aspire to lessen, not strengthen, the human thirst for carnage. Dr. King's quest for Black liberation crystallized in April 1963 during the campaign against the tyrannical policies of white supremacist Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama. Hundreds of demonstrators had been jailed, and King was debating whether to be arrested himself. But the problem was that they had run out of bail money, and so he and the others might just languish in jail. He writes in his autobiography, I thought of the 300 waiting in prison. I thought of the Birmingham Negro community waiting. Then my tortured mind leaped beyond the Gaston Motel, past the city jail, past the city and state lines, and I thought of 20 million Black people who dreamed that someday they might be able to cross the Red Sea of injustice and find their way into the promised land of integration and freedom. There was no more room for doubt. So Dr. King resolved to be arrested. Bull Connor ordered his men to do so, placed King in solitary confinement. 4 days later, on scraps of paper, he penned his letter from Birmingham jail. Meanwhile, Harry Belafonte was able to raise $50,000 for bail bonds to redeem Dr. King and other captives. King's arrest allowed for his liberation, but also for the publication of arguably his most important work. That letter, his other writings and speeches, the movement that he led has inspired countless others, including the mass movement for the liberation of Soviet Jews. What does derech eretz ask of us in this moment? What is the decent and the right thing? It is to work to enfranchise more voices here in this country and in Eretz Israel. We cannot do this alone, of course. Many Israelis and Palestinian citizens of Israel are already doing that work, the work of common sense solution making. In March, we'll hear from our member, Rabbi Donna Kirschbaum, about her wonderful organization, which has received numerous accolades for their peace-building initiatives. My friends, as the guns fall silent, as the hostages return home, Palestinians in the occupied territories will also need to think about the life that they want to build. The realization of a permanent solution to the conflict is a long way off. But as we learned 3,200 years ago in the wilderness of Sinai, as African Americans surely know, liberation is an iterative process. We'll need courageous leaders to emerge on all sides of numerous borders around the world. We'll need economists and civil servants to build infrastructure. We'll need thought leaders to help shape a narrative of peace and coexistence. And yes, we'll need poets and we'll need songwriters to remind us what we're fighting for, what we're escaping from, and what we must move toward. Derech Eretz, the way home, the path to the promised land. So allow me to close with a verse from two other folk songs. One is Israeli singer David Broza's iconic Yetov, It Will Be Good, which feels aspirational to the point of naivete these days, but that's, I think, why we need it, and songs like it. Here's the verse I'm thinking of from Yonatan Geffen's lyrics. We will yet learn to live together between the groves of olive trees. Children will live without fear, without borders, without bomb shelters. On graves grass will grow. For peace and love, 100 years of war. Vod lo avda et hatikva, but we have not yet lost our hope. My friends, this hope must extend from here to there and back again. On both sides of the pond, we need to be thinking about what it means to make forward progress. What is this iterative liberation? Because as we understand, it's not just individuals doing so, but it's the collective. The collective can sometimes be the mob, can do violence. But good collectives can lead us toward a more promising future. As the Holocaust survivor and thought leader Viktor Frankl taught us, it's not simply about freedom. It's not only about liberation and liberty. It's also about obligation and responsibility. We together need to find one another in this country, in that country, around the world, resisting this temptation, this moving toward authoritarianism, and come together around a collective liberation that moves more of us toward the good. So I think finally, we should end with the inimitable Peter Yara, who died just 11 days ago. Perhaps you'll sing this one with me as we conclude. Tell me why you're crying, my son. I know you're frightened like everyone. Is it the thunder in the distance you fear? Will it help if I stay very near? I am here. And if you take my hand, my son, all will be well when the day is done. And if you take my hand, my son, all will be well when the day is done. Day is done, when the day is done. Day is done, when the day is done. Shabbat Shalom.